Hello and welcome back to the Marriage Preparation course. This session we'll be looking at resolving conflict.
But first, a story. A concerned husband who was getting on a bit went to his doctor to talk about his wife. The husband said, "Doctor, I think my wife is getting very deaf because she never hears me the first time and I always have to repeat everything I say." The doctor told him, "Go home and tonight stand some distance from her and say something. If she doesn't reply, move a bit closer and say it again. Keep doing this until she responds. Then we can get an idea of the severity of her deafness." So the husband goes home and does exactly what the doctor has instructed. He starts off the other side of the kitchen behind his wife, who has her back turned, chopping some vegetables. And he says to her, "Darling, what are you cooking?" No response. He moves closer and asks again. Still no response. He moves closer. Still no reply. At this point, he gets fed up and moves right up behind her and yells into her ear, "Darling, what are you cooking?" At which point she turns round and says in an exasperated voice, "For the 5th time I said lamb curry." At times of disagreement, it's easy to blame each other, but it may be that the problem lies with us.
I always blame Deborah for every single problem that happens in my life. Yes, that's probably the case. Last night, for example, I almost ran over these two people at a zebra crossing, and it was Deborah's fault for some reason. I don't know how I quite made it your fault, but I found a way to make it her fault. Then I almost ran into a bus right after that, and it was her fault as well. And then I took the wrong direction, and that was your fault too. So yeah, we do that. We do blame each other quite a bit.
Conflict is an inevitable and normal part of any marriage. Professor John Gottman, a psychologist who's been analysing the habits of married couples since 1972, said, "Fighting, when it airs grievances and complaints, can be one of the healthiest things a couple can do for their relationship."
The issue isn't whether we'll disagree. The issue is how we deal with those disagreements.
We want to look at 3 reasons why we experience conflict in marriage. First, we're different. Some of those differences may come through our gender. We came across these 2 conversations. The first between 2 women. Woman 1, "Have you had a haircut?" Woman 2, "Yes, I have. Thanks for noticing." Woman 1, "It really suits you." "Oh, do you think so? You don't think it's too short?" "No, you've got such a great shaped face. I could never get away with it that short." "I think you'd look great with it short too, especially with your cheekbones." "No, but with my curly hair it wouldn't work. It looks so much better with straight hair like yours." "Oh, but straight hair is so boring."
The second conversation was between 2 men. Man 1, "Haircut." Man 2, "Yeah. Did you see the football last night?" There's probably some truth in that somewhere. But we suggest you guard against gender stereotypes. Your wife may be very different from your mother or your sister. Your husband not at all like your father or brother. We're all individuals, and we come into marriage with different backgrounds, different desires, different priorities, and different personalities. No couple will agree on everything.
So, the first reason for conflict is we're all different. And the second reason is that we're all selfish. Let's admit it. It's easier for us to focus on my desires, my opinions, my needs, than on those of our husband or wife.
I was really shocked when I got married to discover, actually, that I was a lot more selfish than I realised. I thought I was quite relaxed about most things, and suddenly sharing my life, my space, my living space was very challenging. And for me, it was like having a mirror up to my face saying, "This is how selfish I am," and it was very alarming. But we talked a lot about that, and a lot of things just aren't important, so you actually just have to be honest enough to work through them. And I hope I'm a little less selfish now.
The third reason for conflict is that we've given up our independence. It takes adjustment to remember to take the other person into account all the time. Sometimes we may not even realise that we're still acting as though we're single.
There's areas where I've recognised my own self-centeredness in a relationship, especially when you spend a lot of time on your own prior, you sort of like, you don't have to think too much about somebody else. You just sort of like do your own thing, come and go as and when you need to, you know. From work and working late, I'll sort of stay there and just get on with it and come home. I mean, for an example, it's like you know, as a teacher, you do after school clubs and stuff like that. I sometimes forget to, well, not even think about phoning Steve and saying, oh, you know, I'm going to be late. And I'd sort of stay there, do my work, and then come home. And it's like gone 7 o'clock, and Steve's not known where I've been, like, you know, what's happened to me. School finishes at 3:30, and I'm like coming home at 7. And he's wondered, and like, you know, that's been a problem.
And yeah. I mean, I think it's about organising your time as well, so that you don't just spend a lot of time doing what you want to do. Because I like going to the gym, and I found that if I go to the gym once work is done, I'll get home for about 7:30, which means most of the evening's gone. So what I try to do is I try to go to the gym in the morning, when Hazel's at work, if I'm doing it late, or on a weekend if you're busy or something. So it's about making time as well, and not just thinking about what you want to do. You've got to think about the other person.
Mike Mason, in his book The Mystery of Marriage, describes what it means to give up our independence.
He writes, a marriage or a marriage partner may be compared to a great tree growing right up through the centre of one's living room. It is something that is just there, and it is huge, and everything has been built around it. And wherever one happens to be going, to the fridge, to bed, to the bathroom, or out of the front door, the tree has to be taken into account. It cannot be gone through, it must respectfully be gone around. It is somehow bigger and stronger than oneself. True, it could be chopped down, but not without tearing the house apart. And certainly it is beautiful, unique, exotic, but also, let's face it, it is at times an enormous inconvenience.
Marriage means we can no longer do just what we want, when we want. And if we keep doing our own thing and fail to take each other into account, this can lead to frustration and anger. So, how do we resolve conflict effectively? First of all, we need to learn to handle our anger.
We want to be clear, anger is not wrong in itself. Indeed, it's part of our God-given makeup.
It's what we feel when something is wrong, when something needs to be sorted out, when we or someone else has been unjustly treated or hurt or offended. The adrenaline rush that we feel when we get angry is designed to get us to do something about the situation.
But anger can be used wrongly in a number of different ways. And we want to look at 2 inappropriate ways of using anger. And it seems that roughly half of the population has a tendency to misuse anger in one way, while the other half has a tendency to misuse it in the other way.
Half the population, when they get angry, let you know it. We call them the rhinos, because if you provoke a rhino, it's quite likely to put down its head and charge you.
The other half of the population hide their anger. When they're angry, they become quieter or withdraw. We call them the hedgehogs, because when a hedgehog is threatened, it curls itself up into a ball and sticks out its prickles to keep others at a distance.
It's not that the hedgehogs don't feel anger, but they display it differently. They may withhold affection or suddenly develop very selective hearing towards their husband or wife.
And hedgehog behaviour is just as damaging in a marriage as rhino behaviour. People who behave like this might think, I don't want to deal with this, or if I don't do anything about it, it will go away. But in reality, the anger doesn't go away. It's just buried. And when we can't hold any more anger inside us, we're liable to explode in one way or another.
Both rhinos and hedgehogs must learn to handle their anger properly. Uncontrolled anger has terrible consequences. With rhino behaviour, a husband or wife lives with the constant fear of an explosion.
And with hedgehog behaviour, there's an erosion of intimacy as resentment builds up. Both are damaging and ineffective ways of resolving conflict.
We want you to ask yourself, which way do I have a tendency to go? In case you're not sure, you just might want to check with your fiancé, who may have a better idea. And we're going to give you 5 minutes to do that.
Let's see what you've discovered. Put up a hand if you think you're marrying someone with rhino tendencies. OK. Now put up a hand if you think you're marrying someone with hedgehog tendencies. Yeah, that's about half and half. And finally, put up a hand if you're marrying someone who's the opposite to yourself.
We're amazed every time we ask those questions how often rhinos are marrying hedgehogs. As you may have guessed by now, I'm the rhino and Nikki's the hedgehog. But that's fine. We just have to be aware of our own tendency and learn to control it.
I'm a rhino and Chris is a hedgehog, and it's caused quite a few problems in the past, but now we understand what that means. I understand now how I need to draw Chris out when he's run away and curled up in a ball, and you've learnt to cope with me as a rhino a bit more, haven't you?
A bit more, yes. When you're on full flight, it gets a bit frightening, but yes, it's been quite interesting. I don't have to curl up in a little prickly ball as much as I used to, do I?
No, no. So I don't charge quite as much now as I used to.
So, resolving conflict requires us to learn to handle our anger properly. We're going to be looking later at how rhinos and hedgehogs can air disagreements in a constructive way without hurting each other in the process. We're going to look now at the next thing that's important for resolving conflict.
Resolving conflict effectively also requires us to recognise and accept our differences. Some of us are cautious. We take a long time to make decisions. Others of us are more impetuous. We make decisions quickly and easily.
Some of us are more focused on tasks. We set ourselves goals and seek to get the job done quickly and efficiently. Others of us are more focused on relationships. We're always considering how what we're doing is affecting others.
Some of us are highly organised. We make plans well in advance. Others of us prefer to just go with the flow. We like to keep our options open in case we find a better alternative or perhaps even a cheaper deal.
I guess what we found since we've been married is that I'm certainly more spontaneous than Amy is. Amy likes to plan and be very organised in the way she runs her life, and my life too as well. Whereas I'm more spontaneous. I like to have options open and decide things at the last minute. And I guess that in the way we approach dates as well, I like to be a bit more spontaneous about our dates, see what's available at the time, check out the latest offers, who's in town and what's going on, whereas Amy's certainly more likes to know a few weeks in advance, if not months.
Yeah, I think that's true, actually. I do like to schedule things in. I like to know what's happening. So Jason brought up having dates, and Jason likes to be more spontaneous about things. And I found that actually that's not such a bad thing. At first, I got quite frustrated because I didn't know what we were going to be doing. You know, and I need to know like months in advance so that I could just block it out. But then I realised actually not knowing had a certain edge of mystery and excitement to it. So we're learning to compromise on that. We're learning to schedule in dates, but also I'm learning not to panic if I don't know what's happening until like the day before.
Another difference between us may be that one of us likes to take the lead, to be in charge and to initiate change, while the other one prefers to support. They like to help others fulfil their goals.
As we said on session 1, some of us are extroverts like me. An extrovert is someone who's restored and reinvigorated through spending time with other people. Others are more introverted like Nikki. He restores his energy through spending time alone.
While these differences between us can cause friction, actually they're also a good thing, as it's through our differences that we complement each other.
Our main differences, I think, is I'm a bit of a doer. I like to do things, I like to get things done, I like to be spontaneous. Hazel's not, you know, which isn't a bad thing, because I think you need to bounce off of one another. I tend to rush in a bit, but then things get done, whereas Hazel sit back and think a bit more. I
like to call it
maybe
planning.
Think a bit more.
It's planning.
But I think it works well, because I think if I married a girl that was a bit like me, she'd drive me up the wall. So we mix well and it gels well. I think that's why it works. I think because we are, different in that sense.
We must recognise and accept our differences. One attitude is not better or worse than the other. It's just different.
And we can't expect to change each other. And anyway, it would be boring if we were the same in everything.
There's one very significant area where many couples have a very different approach, and that's with the issue of money.
The main reason for arguments about money is our different approaches to working out our finances.
When Nikki and I got married, our attitudes towards money were very different. I think that had a lot to do with our personalities, although our parents probably helped to shape our views as well. If you look at the three choices of what we can do with money, save it, spend it, or give it away, I'd say Nikki and I have always agreed on how much and when we should give. But with the other two options, we're poles apart.
You can say that again. I think I describe myself more as a natural saver, while Scylla's more of a natural spender. And by that, I don't mean that Scylla's in any way a compulsive shopper, nor does she particularly enjoy shopping any more than I do. It's just that she finds it easier to spend money than I do. In fact, quite a bit easier.
When we were first married, we went into overdraft every month, as you'd heard before. Because of Nikki's saving tendencies, he'd put enough aside to pay it off. But every month, I ended up feeling guilty for overspending, and Nikki felt resentful about it.
At that stage, we both thought that I was better with money than Scylla. And it was only after 15 years of marriage and quite a lot of conflict that it all came to a head and we had a big discussion. And it suddenly came home to me that I'm not better. In one sense, Scylla's much better with money than I am. She's incredibly generous. She's good at working out what's needed each week, as well as buying occasional treats and surprises for the family and presents for others.
It was at the point of our big discussion that we both realised we're better at different things. Nikki is better at managing money, and I suppose I'm better at using money. That realisation made all the difference to us.
Admittedly, we did have to sit down and work out a proper budget, which helped a lot. But I can honestly say that since then, I've not felt any resentment of the way that Scylla spends more easily than I do. Rather, I appreciate what Scylla is good at, and we've recognised how we can help each other. Scylla certainly helps me not to be overcautious, and I try to help Scylla to keep account.
We can now see it would have been a lot better not to have waited 15 years to do our first proper budget.
So, it's worth being aware that we're very likely to have different approaches to finances.
I'm definitely the spender in the relationship.
And I'm definitely a saver.
Before we got married, at the end of a month, before I'd get my next salary, I found it quite exciting if I had hardly anything left the last 10 days.
And I get more excited about saving money than actually spending it.
And so that has been quite a thing in our relationship, hasn't it?
So when we first got married, I got relatively frightened by Inger's way of spending the money, and she didn't think it was much fun that we tried to save any money. So we had to sit down and talk about it.
And what we decided was that all our money just goes into one pot, and then each month, each person gets a sort of small slice of that money, and we can do anything we want with that money. And the other person has, can't say anything about how it's spent or how it's saved. And within the first 2 days, my money is usually gone.
And I often manage to roll over a big chunk of it until the next month.
Another issue where Nikki and I are very different is our approach to catching trains, planes and ferries. My way is to get there with plenty of time to spare. I like to have time to buy a magazine for the journey, have a cup of coffee and just hang around watching people.
I like to get there at the last possible minute. As Winston Churchill once said, I like to give the train a sporting chance. It feels to me like a waste of time to get there early when I could be doing useful things at home. It's always been clear to me how Scylla takes after her father. The fact that I take after my father, who died 7 years ago, only came home to me very recently. I was travelling with my mother the other day, and I'd left at the last possible minute as usual. And as we were standing on the platform, she said to me, I'd forgotten until today what it was like travelling with your father. I don't know how I lived with it for 42 years. Well, since then, I've made a new resolution to leave more time to make it less stressful for Scilla, and if I'm perfectly honest, for myself as well.
And I have to remind myself that I'm glad Nicky's not like my father, who always got us to places hours early, much to my embarrassment.
So, we balance each other out. If it was all up to Scilla, we'd arrive far too early, and if it was all up to me, we'd always be in a rush.
We do approach timekeeping incredibly differently. Yeah. And, well, this, I think that what highlighted it for me was going on holiday. And we have this thing we call Ludford time, which is, my maiden name is Ludford. And when we go off on holiday, in my family of origin, we'd set off incredibly early in the morning, like 4 or 5 in the morning, we'd set off in the car. And we'd get there in plenty of time. Whereas
McCulloch time is sort of lastminute.com, so it's rushing to the airport with just enough time to spare and...
Not even sure which airport or how they're going to get to the airport.
You sort of work out as you go along.
And
it's much more fun.
Completely stresses me out. So we're adjusting.
Yeah.
We're kind of trying to find a middle ground.
So you can see, it's very important to recognise our differences and to accept them. Then we can appreciate each other's strengths and support each other's weaknesses. In that way, we can work together effectively.
We'd like you now to turn to the exercise in the manuals that's about looking at your differences. You'll see, if you have a look, that we want you to mark against each issue on the left-hand side where on the line you think you and your fiancé's preferences lie. In the examples on the issue of money, you'll see Scilla's much closer to the spending, while I'm further towards the saving end. And on the issue of punctuality, Scilla likes to have time in hand, while I prefer to cut it fine.
We want each of you to put down your own and your fiancé's initials before exchanging booklets and comparing, and then discuss how you complement each other with one of those differences. And we're going to give you 10 minutes to do that. The third area for resolving conflict effectively is to look for solutions together. People deal with conflict in different ways.
As we said in the last session, when we're under pressure, we so easily revert to the behaviour that we learnt when we were growing up. We're going to give you an opportunity in a few minutes to talk about how each of you tends to react in a conflict.
Some people go on the attack, like the rhino. That's when we try to force the other person to do things our way.
Some people surrender, a bit like the hedgehog. We may be frightened of conflict. We may hide, run away, or do anything to avoid confrontation.
Some people bargain, which is when we say, I'll do this if you do that. This way sounds great in theory, but in practice we end up saying, I'm not going to do my bit because you haven't done your bit.
None of these really help us to sort out the problem. But there is an effective way, and that is to look for a solution to the problem together. Looking for a solution means saying, we've got an issue that's causing conflict that we need to resolve together.
It means seeing that we're on the same side, not opposite sides. That we can discuss the issue together, and that we can find a solution that's best for our marriage.
When we first got married, we renovated a flat, and we had a real problem choosing the kitchen cabinets.
My idea of the perfect kitchen cabinet was this kind of old antique look.
And I like light, like birchwood type.
And birchwood is my absolute least favorite.
And I hate antique.
So we stood in the kitchen and we were thinking, what is the solution to this? Do we do half antique, half birch, half antique, half birch on each of the cupboards, which wouldn't look great? Or does one person win the argument?
But as good Swedes, we went to IKEA to have a last look what we could get.
And we really didn't have very sort of high expectations that we would find anything that we would both like, because we are quite different from each other.
But when we came there, we saw this white, old-looking kitchen cabinet, and we both fell for it. And it was both light, and it looked old. And we found a solution that was us.
And that's really been something that we've looked back at since we got married. Not one person winning the argument or a compromise that neither is happy with, but actually finding this kind of us solution.
If we want to find solutions that work for us, there are 6 steps that will help us to resolve conflict effectively.
The first one is to be ready to hit the pause button. We all recognise that there are bad times to try and resolve arguments, such as when we're about to leave for work or when we've just got home from work.
A survey by the counselling organisation Relate found that 1/4 of those questioned admitted to arguing in the stressful moments leading up to a special occasion, while half of all arguments between couples take place in the evening.
We certainly contributed towards that half. In the early stages of our marriage, we recognised that the most pointless arguments we had were almost always late at night. We have some friends called Charlie and Serena who were married 1 week before us. And I remember them telling us of a rule that they'd imposed early on in their marriage, which they called the 10 o'clock rule.
They explained that if they were having an argument in the evening and it was after 10 p.m, either one of them could call the 10 o'clock rule into play. That meant that any further discussion on the topic had to be postponed until a better time, perhaps earlier the following evening or at the weekend.
We've used the 10 o'clock rule many times since then. It certainly takes self-discipline, but then self-discipline is a big part of resolving conflict. Hitting the pause button may mean deferring the discussion to the next day.
Or it may mean stopping for 5 minutes while we cool down, especially if we know we're losing control. What I find really helpful is simply to go into another room and count to 20, or go outside and take a few deep breaths.
Another time to hit the pause button is when conflict happens in the wrong place. We have some friends who argued a lot in their first year of marriage, and they decided to make their home a conflict-free zone. If they had an argument, they decided they'd go for a walk together. They found that even the act of putting on their coats helped them to discuss it more rationally.
Another unhelpful place is in front of other people.
I really hate arguing in public, primarily because it's embarrassing for me.
I learnt that he doesn't like that pretty early on, because I like to get things out in the open, cleared up and everything immediately. But I agree with him now that it's just not a good thing to argue in public. You should sort it out in private.
The first step is to be prepared to hit the pause button. The second step for resolving conflict effectively is to identify the issue. Again and again, couples say to us that their arguments get widened, and sometimes they can't remember what it was they were arguing about in the first place.
When I was growing up myself as a child with my mum and dad, my mother used to be able to keep arguments going for weeks, basically, and we kind of make my dad suffer for maybe starting an argument or getting involved in it. And my father would try and, after an argument, make his peace with my mum, and my mum wouldn't have it. She'd sort of torture him for a week or so. So I grew up in that sort of. That's how I resolved conflict in a way. And what I've learned, I suppose, is it's not a good thing to do that. It's not good to keep it going, because if you do keep it going, and there's a negative aspect gets to everything, and then everything is annoying. And then the arguments just go all over the place instead of just staying centred on the one thing.
I think we used to argue for hours at a time, and over the years that's decreased, and I think we just reached the point where it's accepting that each other has a completely different opinion sometimes. You've had different life experiences, and sometimes you're not going to convince your partner that your opinion is the right one, because they see things very differently. And I think in our upbringing we've had different experiences. I would sit on the sofa for hours talking to my mother and resolving conflict in sort of talking and communicating. And with Paul and I think we really had to learn to communicate with each other and not have all this sort of stuff from outside coming in.
And keep it centred on one issue and not go off on tangents.
Yeah.
Identifying and articulating the issue is often the most important part of preventing conflicts escalating. I find it helpful to imagine that we're on a 3-seater sofa. We're at either end of the sofa with this issue between us, separating us from each other. What we need to do is identify the issue that's come between us, put it out in front of us, and then move towards each other on the sofa and work on the issue together.
So the third step is to discuss the issue rather than attack each other. This may well involve us learning to control our temper. A bad temper can cause people to become physically violent, which will always destroy a marriage. But words can be equally abusive.
In an article I read recently, Libby Purvis, a writer and journalist, quotes a young wife called Maureen, who suffered serious negative consequences as a result of an argument with her husband. Maureen said this: "My husband once told me I was a selfish, stupid, fat, frigid bitch. Admittedly, I just called him worse things, but when he said that about being frigid, I couldn't forget it. Whenever we make love now, I keep thinking that's what he thinks about me. I sort of stopped trusting him."
Libby Purvis goes on to comment about Maureen. She's also dieting obsessively, slim though she is, because of the fat bit of the insult. The old line, "angry people always say things they don't mean," is counterbalanced by the equally old line that only when you're angry do you dare say what you really mean. Most of us have a fairly total recall of things said to us in anger.
Avoiding labelling each other will help us not to attack each other. I remember the vicar who married us giving us a very helpful tip. He said there are 2 phrases to avoid at all costs in marriage: "you always" and "you never." When we use these phrases, we start to label each other's character. "You never lift a finger to help," or "you always tell other people our secrets," or "you always make us late."
It's much more productive to use I statements rather than you statements, and to talk about our own feelings. That opens the way for positive discussion.
So, rather than saying "you never lift a finger to help," it's much more helpful to say "I'm upset that you didn't help me clear up."
And instead of "you always tell other people our secrets," it's better to say something like "I feel hurt when you tell people everything we talk about."
And rather than saying "you always make us late," it'll be more productive to say something like "I don't like leaving for the train so late. It makes me feel stressed."
The third step is to discuss the issue rather than attack each other. The fourth step in resolving conflict is to listen to each other. Before trying to find a solution, we need to first try to understand each other's perspective.
When we're having an argument, we're usually very keen that our partner understands our point of view, but we're not quite so keen to understand theirs.
So, a simple but very effective ground rule is this: take it in turns to talk.
I think once we've been on the course and we read the book, we sort of realised that when we have conflict, both of you doing that just doesn't work, you know, because it just winds you both up. So we've just learnt to, okay, you have your say, I have my say, and then we'll meet in the middle, or try to meet in the middle, and that's what's worked. I mean, it really does work.
When it's our turn to listen, it's a good idea not to spend the time thinking about what we're going to say next.
The fifth step is to work out possible solutions. That may sound unrealistic in the middle of a heated discussion, but if we followed the first 4 steps, this becomes possible.
Talk about different possibilities. It sometimes helps to write things down on paper, particularly if it's a really big issue that's been unresolved for some time.
The 6th and final step for resolving conflict is to choose the best solution for your relationship and see if it works.
If it works, the issue will stop causing conflict. If it doesn't work, we need to go back to the other solutions that we came up with until we find one that does work. The solution we try doesn't have to be set in stone.
There may be times when we can't work things out, and it can be very helpful to talk to someone, maybe a friend or your course leader or a counsellor.
OK, over to you now. Please turn to the next exercise called Using the 6 Steps, and we'll give you 15 minutes to discuss those questions. Given that finances are such a big issue for so many couples, we want to spend this next section addressing the subject of how we sort out our money.
As we work out how to organise our finances, we do so with the understanding that marriage involves sharing everything.
In the marriage service, the bride and groom say to each other, "All that I am, I give to you, and all that I have, I share with you.
Sometimes that's easier said than done. I remember a woman who'd been married for a few years saying to us, "I was fine with money until I had to share it."
Every couple needs to set aside time to discuss finances. We need clear understanding and agreement between us. We store up problems for the future if we fail to talk about how we will